Rejoice, everyone. We're back with another Sekhie Reacts to Fate. We've grouped together 3 whole people this time.
This was my idea.
Look, there's a consistent theme amongst them.
Yeah.
Fuck the Romans.
Yeah. And that's why. That's why we grouped them together. Also, so I was a little circumspect about the last hint. The reference I was making was that some sources say that Zenobia was descended from Cleopatra through her daughter Cleopatra S.I.N. But that's very contested and not proven. But I definitely made a mention of it in the video because I remember talking about her fucked up family tree and how there were several points where the family tree just tangled in on itself between uncles and nieces and brothers and sisters.
Just in case you guys didn't pay attention to the name, the thumbnail, or history about fucking the Romans, today we're going to be discussing Spartacus, Boudica, and Zenobia.
Yes. Boudica, Spartacus, and Zenobia. What?
Okay.
I'm just saying.
Same 3 names I just said.
Never mind. So, I say that because the joke was in the document we have it listed as Boudica, Spartacus, and Zenobia.
Really doesn't matter.
Yes, it does. Boudica is fantastic. We're starting with her. Also, because I kind of, since I played through the Rome chapter, Boudica is one of like the main characters I wanted to see that I haven't gotten to see, you know?
As far as my presentation's going to go, she's second, because the order I'm going to go is their order of introduction to Fate, but that's my order. You can do whatever order you want for your order.
Fine.
No, you take your order, especially if it's easier. If it's easier, I don't know if it's a history thing. I don't know which one came first, history-wise, but whatever's easier for you, whatever order makes most sense for you, history section. This is your section. You do with it as you please.
Well, I mean, if we were just going by who's the earliest, it is Spartacus, because Spartacus is still in the BC. Meanwhile, Boudica is just barely AD along with Nero, and Zenobia is a while, as she would have to be several generations removed from Cleopatra S.I.N. and Cleopatra herself.
Unintentionally following canonical historical order for the win.
Also putting the man first in this video, even though there are 2 stunning women we're going to talk about.
The man was literally first.
But I like Boudica more.
I don't care.
So, starting with Spartacus. Spartacus was a Thracian and possibly a member of the T.H.E tribe, according to Plutarch, although there are contested kind of descriptions of him in his early life by several different scholars. S.I.N and Florus also wrote about him. And according to S.I.N, he was Thracian by birth and had once served with the Romans as a soldier, but had since been a prisoner and been sold as a gladiator. That's generally agreed on by several of the different scholars, is that he eventually became a prisoner of the Romans and then a gladiator by some way. And sort of where he's a gladiator is where our story takes place. But I do think it's interesting. Plutarch mentions that he has a wife who was a prophetess of his tribe who was also enslaved alongside him, which is interesting. The name Spartacus is typically found around the Black Sea region, and he's described as being part of the T.H.E people and Thrace, and that would have been present-day kind of southwestern Bulgaria. Right, so we're moving kind of up and east slightly from what you would think of as traditionally Roman. And we got an approximate birth year around 103 based on the date of the rebellion and how old he would have been, and then just counting backwards. We know that he died in 71 when he was about age 32. So, put his birth around the year 100 BCE. Once he was taken captive, he was trained as a gladiator at a school near Capua that belonged to a man named Basiatus, and there he was trained to be a marmilo, or a heavyweight gladiator, who fought using a long scutum, or shield, and a sword with a really big, broad blade that would have been called a gladius, about 18 inches long at the blade. However, in 73 BC, he becomes known in the historical record, very famously, because he joins a group of gladiators plotting an escape. Known as part of the Third Servile War, he was in command of the rebel army. Where's the Star Wars music?
Behind a Curtain, copyrighted by Disney and John Williams.
Oh, is it bad now?
Disney's been... Star Wars has always been kind of a hard one to get the copyright, to get... Like, you can get... It's bad. It's really bad.
I didn't think it was that bad. So many people use it all over.
Maybe on TikTok, that's just because the copyright police haven't figured out how to work with TikTok yet.
Love that for them. So there were about 70 slaves who were a part of this plot. So not a whole lot of them, but what they did was they seized utensils they could find from all over the school, including kitchen utensils, fought their way free of the school, at which point they seized gladiatorial weapons and armor that were stored there. And as they escaped, they plundered the region in the area, recruiting many other slaves into their ranks and eventually taking a defensive position around Mount Vesuvius. Which, by the way, come join the Vesuvius fun run! I mean, you know, maybe if they'd lived till, you know, just, was it? If only it was like 100 years later. Vesuvius fun run! 79 AD.
You deserve to burn in hell for that, right?
Why?
Because you'd only be burning half as much as the people of Pompeii.
So of the escaped gladiators, Spartacus and two other slaves known as Cretius and Wenemaeus were chosen as leaders for their little rebellion. And although Roman authors often assumed that this was a homogeneous group with Spartacus as a leader, there was likely a separate military and hierarchical view of leadership within the group itself, which led to there being a division between three different leaders. Unfortunately, the Romans... Well, actually, no, we're not going to start that with unfortunately. Fortunately, the Romans were unable to immediately put down this revolt because the Roman legions in the area were engaged in fighting a revolt both in Hispania and then the Third Mithridatic War. Also, because this was a slave uprising, it wasn't technically considered a war to the Romans. It was considered a policing matter. So instead of a legion being dispatched, Rome would dispatch militia under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber to besiege the camp on Mount Vesuvius, hopeful that starvation would force the slaves to surrender. Unfortunately, they were taken a bit by surprise when Spartacus weaved ropes from vines and used them to climb down the sides of the volcano with his men, attacking the camp in the rear and killing most of the militia there. Right up the butt. The rebels would then succeed in defeating another expedition led against them, almost capturing the praetor commander of that one as well, killing his lieutenants and seizing all their military equipment. Because of these successes, more and more slaves flocked to the forces, as did a lot of the herdsmen and shepherds of the region, which swelled the ranks of this from the original 70 to about 70,000. Now this becomes a war.
Yeah, that went from a gang to an actual military.
Yeah, like 70 people, that could definitely just be like a gang. 70,000 people, that is an army. That's not even a militia, that is an army. Interestingly enough, at the height of the rebellion, this army included people of many different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, including Celts, Gauls, and Romans. Due to the previous social war in 91 to 87 BC, some of his ranks were even made up by legion veterans who had retired. Of the slaves that joined them, many were from the countryside, as only 70 had come out of the original gladiatorial school. But rural slaves lived a better life that prepared them to fight in Spartacus's army because they would have been trained just in case they had to encounter warfare on the frontier. In contrast, urban slaves were very used to city life and would not have been as useful. So actually the incorporation of countryside slaves was to his advantage, because at least these slaves were at least somewhat trained in weaponry and defending themselves because of their place on the Roman frontier. Throughout the various battles of this Third Servile War, Spartacus proved to be a really good tactician, which is what indicates to historians that he likely had previous military experience with the Roman army. So although the rebels themselves lacked traditional military training, they displayed a number of useful skills and unusual tactics that worked very well against the Roman armies and their traditionally trained tactics. The winter of 73 to 72 was spent training, arming, and equipping all of the new recruits and expanding their territory to include the towns of Nola, Nuceria, Thuril, and Metapontum. The distance between these areas and subsequent events meant that the slaves were separated into two groups, one commanded by Spartacus and the other by Cretius. In 72, they began to move northward. At the same time, the Roman Senate, finally a little bit alarmed by the defeat of the Praetorians, were like, okay, so let's dispatch some consular legions. We'll give the command to Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus.
Some of these names, I swear.
Well, we're really just going to call them Gnaeus and Lucius, I'm pretty sure. Moving forward, they're not that important. The two legions were initially successful, defeating a group of about 30,000 commanded by Cretius near Mount Garginus, but were then subsequently defeated by Spartacus. These defeats are depicted in divergent ways by historians of war, namely Plutarch and Appian. Unfortunately, the Senate was not super happy about the fact that both of their legions failed. So they then charged Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was the wealthiest man in Rome at this time, and the only person who was willing to volunteer for this position at the time, a bit of a twofer there, with ending the rebellion. Now, something to note about Crassus is Crassus was a member of the First Triumvirate. And we've talked about the First Triumvirate before because that was made of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. And Crassus was included in this largely because of how wealthy he was, not because of military power or fame like Caesar and Pompey. So Crassus is actually a pretty important name to the story here, and we did touch on him with the Julius Caesar episode. So this is happening contemporary to Caesar. Think about that. Spartacus and Caesar could have met. Can you imagine? That would have been pretty cool. Anyways. So Crassus was put in charge of 8 legions, which numbered about 40,000 together. And he trained them in the idea of decimation, which was an old Roman army tactic, which meant that 1/10 of his men were killed to make them more afraid of him than their enemy. So he executed 1/10 of his forces to make sure that they were more afraid of him than they were of Spartacus and the slaves. Because if he's willing to kill his own men, he's absolutely willing to kill you if you try to desert. Ah, the Romans.
What did I do wrong? Nothing. Dead.
Yeah, nothing. This is a deterrent. So Crassus Spartacus and his followers had retreated to the south of Italy at this point in 71 BC, and Crassus deployed 6 of his legions to the borders of the region and sent his legate Mummius with 2 legions to try to maneuver behind Spartacus. Though he was ordered not to engage the rebels at this point, he attacked at what he thought was an opportune moment, but was in fact very inopportune and was soundly defeated. After this, Crassus was victorious in several engagements, forcing Spartacus further south, and by the end of 71, Spartacus was encamped near the Strait of Messina in the Regium, or Reggio Calabria. Plutarch now says that at this point in time, Spartacus made a deal with Sicilian pirates to transport him and 2,000 of his men to Sicily, where he wanted to gather reinforcements by inciting another slave rebellion. However, he was abandoned by these pirates who took payment and then abandoned all the rebels. Minor sources mention that they may have tried their hand at shipbuilding, but it did not work, and Crassus took measures, according to historians, to make sure they could not cross into Sicily. Spartacus retreated back towards Rhegium once again, and Crassus's legions built fortifications across the isthmus when they arrived, despite the fact that they were being harassed by raids from the rebels. The rebels now were cut off from their supplies and soundly under siege. At this time, Pompey had finally returned from Hispania after putting down the revolt there, and was promptly ordered by the Senate to go help Crassus. Because Crassus is doing okay, but he's not getting rid of him.
That was one hard revolt. I'm glad to be home. I can relax a little, go put down another revolt.
Yeah. I just finished putting down a revolt in Spain. I can enjoy my... No, go. South. Now. I mean, them sucks. That fucking sucks. So, hearing that Pompey was on his way down, Spartacus tried to make a truce with Crassus, because he did not want to face two triumvirate members. When Crassus refused, Spartacus and his army broke through the fortifications, heading to Brundusium, with Crassus's legions in pursuit of his army. While the legions managed to catch a small portion of the rebels separated from the main army, discipline among Spartacus's troops broke down, and small groups began to independently attack the oncoming legions, so Spartacus was forced to now turn his forces around and bring his entire military strength to bear on the legions in one last stand, in which they were routed completely, and the vast majority of them were slaughtered on the battlefield. The final battle that saw the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC took place on the right bank of the river Selle, with the area right near the Calabrio in a valley. And in this area, since 1899, archaeologists have been finding large amounts of armor and swords from the Roman era. Plutarch, Appian, and Florus all agree that Spartacus died during this battle, but Appian says that his body was never found. Only about 6,000 survivors of the revolt that were captured. And remember, we started with 70,000, so 6,000 were captured and crucified, lining the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Over 100 miles of road lined with crucified slaves. Interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure that's where George R.R. Martin got the idea in Game of Thrones, when they're in Assos.
Yeah,
and the slavers have crucified the slaves. Yeah. There's somewhat of an interesting debate amongst historians about what Spartacus's motives might have been, because it doesn't seem like he was trying to present himself as a political force or a military force meant to abolish slavery. It just seems that he really wanted to reach Cisalpine Gaul and allow his men to disperse back to their homes, because the majority of them were Celts and Gauls, which means if they could have made it to the Cisalpine Gaul region, they could have just dispersed from there back to the territories that they originally came from.
So it might have been less of a revolt and more a prison break.
A little bit, yeah. But unfortunately, historians don't know why Spartacus in that case would have then turned south after defeating the initial two legions sent to head that way, because if he had headed straight north after defeating those two initial legions under Lucius Publicola and Gnaeus Clodianus, he actually had a clear path over and through the Alps, so he would have been able to get out. Appius and Florus agree that he intended to march on Rome, but abandoned that goal because it was just unsustainable. But apparently, according to Plutarch, he says that he thought that some of the slaves apparently might have just been pushing Spartacus to let them plunder Italy and roam the countryside rather than escape over the Alps. And maybe because of a divided and non-centric leadership, Spartacus had to kind of play ball with these people, because if they didn't, they would have deserted him and then his force would have been severely weakened. So I'm not quite sure what he intended to get out of this, because it just doesn't, nothing he does make sense on a greater military or political scale. I mean, he jailbreaks, he holds himself up at Vesuvius. I mean, technically he could have waited there and maybe parlayed with someone. I mean, Vesuvius is pretty defensible. And then he headed south, which would which wouldn't have really helped him. I mean, he would have had to find a way to cross the ocean if he was going to head south. And, not a whole lot of, people in coastal towns are going to be like, hey, let's help the slaves. The Romans would not really have done that. And with only 70,000 people, most of whom weren't trained soldiers, officially, marching on Rome is almost unconscionable. I mean, perhaps you would have been able to siege the city, but the minute one of the triumvirate or consuls who had legions in the outer areas, like Pompey in Hispania, heard word, they would have turned back and you would have been surrounded up against the walls of Rome by legions.
So what I'm getting here is that Spartacus probably didn't have as much control over that 70,000 men as he probably would like.
Likely not, because, in my opinion, the smartest move would have been to make for the Cisalpine Gaul, because, to be honest, remember, Caesar was really struggling with the Gauls, right? He fought the Gauls for many, many years, and he wrote his Gallic war docket things. The Gauls were a fairly, not necessarily formidable fighting force, but they put up a very good fight against the Romans. If he'd really intended to oppose Rome, it would have been smarter to head to Cisalpine Gaul, rally support, and then head down into Italy.
There were 30 smarter moves Spartacus could have made at any given point.
Yeah. So the way that he's depicted in sort of romantic and more modern literature is that he was on this sort of doomed quest to free the slaves and abolish slavery in Rome and abolish slavery in the Republic, but it doesn't seem like he was, because nothing he was doing would have led to that point unless he had successfully taken Rome. And that was never going to happen with the force he had.
The other option here is that he just had no idea what he was doing.
Yeah, but I hesitate to think that a man who potentially had Roman military experience was in a Roman gladiatorial school had no knowledge of the way that Rome's military worked, right? That seems like a leap that I would not want to be the person making, because that is presuming a lot of him being very, very stupid. And it doesn't seem like he was all that stupid. It just seems like maybe he just didn't have the tools necessary, whether that be influence and command over his men or just the ability to move the way he wanted to with this force, there's entirely a chance some says of the many of the people who joined him, of the 70,000, a lot were from the countryside. Some of them probably didn't want to go to Cisalpine Gaul. The Romans had fairly successfully circulated propaganda all over the empire about how the Gauls were just savage pagans. And some of those slaves probably believed some of that. Maybe they didn't want to go. Maybe he just got more touchback than he expected. I don't know. That's my opinion.
Okay, I'm not the historian here.
I think certainly he is the leader of a major slave uprising and one of the major leaders of the Third Servile War, but it doesn't seem like anything he was doing was really going to make it. Fun fact, he did, in modern times, become an icon for communism and socialism. Karl Marx wrote about Spartacus as one of his heroes and called him the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history, a great general, a noble character, and a real representation of the ancient proletariat.
So that's why Karl Marx and future communists had trouble actually rallying the communists together.
Interestingly enough, so left-wing revolutionaries have often claimed Spartacus as a mascot. There was the German Spartacus League, which was an early forerunner of the Communist Party of Germany. There was a communist uprising in Germany in 1919 called the Spartacist Uprising. There was a collectively run leftist bookstore chain called Spartacus Books in North America. I believe still exists. There's also several villages in Eastern Europe named after Spartacus, and a god-awful amount of sports teams in Eastern Bloc countries named after Spartacus. There are 3 football clubs in Russia alone named after Spartacus.
So what I'm getting here is we need to stop making Spartacus our patron saint or naming ourselves after a man who likely failed because he couldn't actually organize his group to get something done. That might be a bad idea.
Maybe. Anyways, so you've got a Spartacus for me in Fate.
Do we want to go one by one with the
Might as well. They're not technically connected to one another, so it doesn't make sense to kind of...
Alright, so start us off with that first tab here. Meet Spartacus, the berserker of red from Fate Apocrypha.
Oh, you really struggled there for a second.
Sorry, red and black.
Why... You've seen Robin Hood Men in Tights, right?
Yes.
Why is he wearing Maid Marian's Everlast chastity belt? I'm not wrong. Why is this man in iron bondage gear? Is it because he's a slave? Is that the joke?
There's not much of a joke here. He's just all muscle.
But he's in bondage gear. My dude, that's like a bondage harness.
I mean, he was a slave.
Yeah, well, that's what
It's not a joke so much as that's just part of the design.
Okay, alright, alright.
So, Spartacus is often called the Berserker of Red due to his role in Fate Apocrypha. The events of that anime aren't really relevant to explaining his characterization, so I won't really go over those today. Instead, I'll just say Spartacus is my anarchist son. My moronic anarchist son.
Aww.
But my son nonetheless.
Look at that. Dislikes successive attacks, leaving no room for counterattack. Talents. Receiving. Natural enemy. Oppressors.
So yeah, his entire shtick is overthrowing his oppressors. He's unclear about what he actually means by oppressors, but unlike a lot of berserkers of his build, the giant monstrous big man build, he's fully capable of speech. Speech that he sometimes wields to rather... He can sometimes wield that speech rather eloquently, actually, much unlike Knick-Knack.
Yeah, I can tell.
If you ask him to explain his motivations, or if he is trying to convince someone to throw off their chains, he can actually hold a conversation really well and be downright poetic.
Aw, he's adorable in Capsule Servant.
The other side of that sort of well-spoken side of him is that he won't change his mind if he deems you an oppressor. There's almost no stopping him or convincing him that you're anything but an oppressor if he does get that vibe. I would personally, on my end, classify him as one of the most dangerous servants to use command spells on. Because...
Oh, does he view you as an oppressor if you use a command spell?
Depends on how you use it, but he can, and
so
he
like
can see his master as an oppressor and try to overthrow them.
So, like, let's say if you were just boosting his attack that he's already making, it's fine. But if you order him to do something he doesn't want to do...
Yeah.
Okay. I do see that he has one relationship, and it is to every king servant. It's just, ooh, oppressors!
Yeah. So, here's a fun fact, and this is for the Fate fans out there that might not know. Spartacus is actually the brainchild of Gen Urobuchi, the author of Fate Zero. Originally, he was supposed to be in the early MMO version of Fate Apocrypha, before he ended up being kept for the light novel version that was written by a different author. So if you're wondering why he suddenly was so flushed out in the third Lost Belt, the Chinese Lost Belt of all chapters, it's because he was only finally being used by his original character writer. So, the more you know.
Interesting. I've scrolled down to abilities.
Okay, so
because there were no other relationships other than oppressors.
So Spartacus has weapons, but with the amount of force he puts behind them, it's hard to say that he's using them as anything more than blunt objects.
So you should just give him a very large club.
Probably. He doesn't really even need them. In fact, most of his armor and weapons are mostly window dressing to his life. He's so strong that he's strong enough to just fight barehanded, just primarily grappling and crushing.
Jesus.
But more than his strength, his real power is his durability.
I see that honor of suffering and unyielding will.
It's not hard to get away from Spartacus, and at face value, he's not the most skilled fighter in the world, but you aren't really making a dent in him as he comes towards you continually with his arms spread to get you in a grapple.
Yeah.
And then there's some other fun stuff, such as his ability to, with the help of a command spell, just rebel against gravity. He just launches himself up miles upon miles into the air.
I love that.
That said, that was a feat that may have only been possible with command spells, as he's tried that same rebel against gravity shtick before to less stellar results.
So, obviously I can see the madness enhancement, the honor of suffering, and the unyielding will. I have Spartacus in campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm correct, his Noble Phantasm Crying Warmonger, the way that you have it work is that you basically collect damage dealt to Spartacus, and once it reaches a certain point, you unleash it all on who you're fighting in one big dump. That's Crying Warmonger?
Yes.
Is that how it works in Fate Grand Order?
Not in the game, because that's not really mechanically possible in the spaghetti code.
Well, yeah.
But, yeah, no, that's the shtick. He's taking damage a little at a time, because he also cuts his damage when he's hit.
Yeah.
And that damage converts into magical energy that boosts all of his parameters and makes him even more of a beast in a fight. And because he's not an infinite storage container, he has to unleash it. And if he doesn't unleash it, and I don't think you guys have seen this yet, but I might have noted it. He can actually overload completely, which causes him to just deform into inhumane, disgusting shapes. At the point where, and when he releases that, it can become so explosive, so destructive that at one point it threatened to wipe out an entire village with it.
Love that.
So if you want, we can move on to the Noble Phantasm.
Hang on a sec. All right. Character designer for Shakespeare. Okay, Shakespeare, Jack the Ripper. So we've seen a lot
of the Fate Apocrypha characters.
Yeah, okay. So we've just got the one form. So just the one.
There's two versions of it. One's an old version and one's an animation update.
So this is the old version, I presume?
Yeah.
Not very impressive.
Pretty simple. Noble
Yeah,
Phantasm.
I appreciate the addition of the lines. We needed that.
So next up, all right. So you want to do card arts, or do you want to go do those last?
Let's do them now. All right, gallery. Oh, look, he's the catcher. He stands in the back behind the plate.
Yeah, I think he's the catcher.
Is that it? I'm not good at
receiving
sports ball. Yeah, I'm not good at sports ball. Oh, I didn't even notice he has the chains on him. In the third. Yeah.
Oh, God. So there was a point where we got to see...
The business card.
We got to see Spartacus's worst nightmare, and that's him becoming a corporate wage slave.
Oh. Okay.
When you boot up FGO, sometimes the servants get like little stinger lines. Spartacus is literally, that man was all muscle.
Insurrection. A somber moment begins, the scream of the crowd, their insults, their cheers. Ignore them and focus on your comrade before you. A hungry lion bears its fangs. Its hunger has made it dangerous, and you hear it has already devoured 3 men. Both he and you must kill or be killed. That's why the beast's death was certain. How sad, you tyrants, who would toy with the lives of man and beast. Your hour shall come, for I, Spartacus, swear I shall defeat you with a fatal blow. I also read that entire last line wrong. It's for I, Spartacus, swear I shall deal you a fatal blow. Did not even notice I was reading it wrong. My mind just made up a new line. First step to rebellion. Valentine's return gift. You, this is truly the first step in rebellion. Next time, we will move on to the leg shackles. Obviously, the final step will be a pillory. Show your colossal strength to those tyrants who treat humans like mere beasts. Hopefully it's made out of chocolate. Oh, yeah, he's in this. I remember this one. It's got Rama in it. Chaldea Beach Volleyball. Chaldea's beach volleyball tournament has finally commenced. With much enthusiasm, playfulness, and muscle, they excitedly set up in teams. But when one thinks of muscle, he would be involved. When you think of him, one would think of his muscled smile. Alex the technician and his outlaw teammate face an opponent who returns every volley, a super powerful receiver who doesn't flinch even after tanking the ball with his face. Is there a chance of winning against a wall that gets stronger every time it gets hit? Damn. That's unfortunate.
I'm just imagining Spartacus playing volleyball, getting smacked with the ball over and over again, and he just smiles, not even trying to hit it.
So this is someone else's.
Yeah, you can't ignore that one.
But there's him, and there's S.I.N.
Yep.
They're collecting squash!
Yep,
Hoeing with sword.
Hoeing with sword.
All right. So I need to go here so I don't accidentally trip into Boudica.
Boudica's turn.
My personal favorite of our 3 today. I love Boudica. So Boudica has been, well, first of all, time period, right? So we know Boudica reigned from 60 to 61. And therefore she died in 60 or 61. We don't really know how old she was, so we don't have sort of a birth date. We know that she had 2 daughters who were, I think, close to full grown at that point, or at least like old enough. So I'd say that she's probably gotta be around 30 plus. But that would be my guess. So that's just my opinion. The Boudican revolt, as it's known, against the Roman Empire is referenced in 4 different works from classical antiquity by 3 Roman historians. The Agricola and Annals by Tacitus, Suetonius in his Lives of the Caesars, and the longest and most detailed description of it is contained within Cassius Dio's History of the Empire. All 3 of these were written after the events occurred, so take the 100% accuracy of everything that is written here with a grain of salt. Most Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio all tended to write about events like long before them, but they did also write about like events that were happening during their time, so it's kind of a crap shot as to whether or not it's actually going to be 100% accurate. Tacitus wrote a long time after the rebellion, but his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, was an eyewitness to the events, so he did have like a first-hand account because he served as a tribune under Suetonius Paulinus during the period where the revolt occurred. Cassius Dio wrote his history of the empire 140 years after Boudica's death, and the only part of his account of Boudica survived was copied by an 11th century Byzantine monk who elaborated on the story a lot. Both Tacitus and Dio like attributed speeches to her in their records, but we have no historical records that she would have ever given speeches like that, anything from the time at all. So take her speeches, if you read them, with a grain of fucking salt. Like, this is maybe one of the worst documented uprisings. So Boudica was originally the consort of Prasutagus, who was the king of the S.I.N people. And the S.I.N people lived in here. So it's like a section of southern, it's the county of Norfolk, east of England, like southeast of England, bordering Lincolnshire and Cambridge. So it's kind of that southeast portion. So we are in Britain, right? Prasutagus died in 6061, right? He was a nominal ally of the Romans. They did not annex his kingdom because he was considered an allied king under their laws. And when he died, he willed his 2 daughters and the Roman emperor at the time, Nero, to be his heirs. And so theoretically what should have happened according to his will was that his daughters would have ruled the tribe and still been in alliance with the emperor at the time, who would have been Nero. That didn't happen. The Romans completely ignored this will that he created, and the kingdom was entirely absorbed into the province of Britannia at the time. And so Catus Decianus, who was the procurator of Britain at the time, Britannia, was sent to secure the kingdom for Rome.
Gotta love those Romans.
Yeah, Tacitus describes the next details of this, and he says that the Romans pillaged the countryside, ransacked the king's household, and when they found Boudica and her daughters, they had Boudica whipped and her daughters raped. At this point, Dio does not mention who did the kind of evil deeds like this, other than noting them down, but he says that there were several reasons for the uprising outside of the brutal treatment of the tribe and the royal family, which were loans given to the Britons by Seneca that they did not repay, and then several other reasons. So he tries to kind of excuse all of it by saying, oh, well, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, and we were only taking rightful control of the land that was now ours. Cassius Dio then attributes a speech to Boudica, which talks about how they've been robbed, and even though they pay taxes, they're being brutalized and stuff like that. Obviously, grain of salt as to whether she actually gave that speech. And said that, but he said that Boudica told their people that life was better before Roman occupation and that wealth cannot be enjoyed under slavery, and that she blamed herself for not expelling the Romans this time like they had done when Julius Caesar invaded Britannia years before. So, thus started an uprising. The first place that the rebels went to was Camulodunum, or modern Colchester, where there was a Roman colony of retired soldiers. So often the frontiers of the Roman Empire were filled out by colonies of veteran soldiers. The soldiers fight in the legions in a particular region, and then often they're given land there that they had just conquered to kind of homestead on, basically. And that would therefore expand the borders of the empire little by little. Rome had this fun thing where they really thought that the best way to defend the empire was to constantly expand it. Like every time you have an outpost, make another one further out to protect the one you already made, and just keep going, right? And that was kind of their whole modus operandi for like the military plans for the empire. It's not necessarily that they were being actively aggressive to all these people, but they really felt that they needed to take proactive action before anyone else tried to attack them. Which is, I mean, it kind of worked out for them a lot of the time. Didn't make many friends, but it worked. At this colony, there had been a temple erected to Claudius. And there was a lot of resentment in this area towards the Romans. So at this point, the Iceni and the Trinovantes made up an army of about 120,000. And Dio claimed that Boudica would call upon the British goddess of victory, Andraste, to aid in her army. And so, once this rebellion had begun, the only Roman troops who were in the island to give assistance, aside from the colony, were about 200 auxiliaries who were stationed in Londinium, who weren't really equipped to deal with this level of fighting. So Camulodunum was captured pretty easily. Those who survived the initial attack took refuge in the Temple of Claudius for 2 days before they were massacred. Quintus Petilianus Cerealis, who was commanding Legion 9 Hispania, attempted to relieve Camulodunum, but suffered an overwhelming defeat to this 120,000 strong force. The infantry with him were all killed, and only the commander and some of his cavalry escaped from this rout. After this disaster, Catus Decianus, who we talked about before, he's in charge of Roman Britain, fled abroad to Gaul rather than stay in Britain. I mean, to be fair, they were coming for him. Suetonius was tasked with leading a campaign against the island of Mona, which was off the coast of North Wales at this time, and upon hearing this, he left a small garrison and returned with the rest of his force to deal with Boudica. He moved quickly through hostile territory to Londinium and managed to reach before Boudica did, but was outnumbered, and so he decided to order the town to be abandoned, to the rebels, who would burn it down and torture and kill everyone left in it. And he viewed this as necessary because he could not hold Londinium. The rebels would also sack Verulamium, which is modern St. Albans, which was slightly to the northwest of London. And at this point, Dio and Tacitus both report that over 80,000 people had been killed by this rebel force. According to Tacitus, the Britons had no desire to take Roman population as prisoners and would just slaughter them. Dio writes in one of his accounts that even the noblewomen were impaled upon spikes with their breasts cut off and sewn to their mouths as part of sacrifices and banquets to the goddess Andraste, which we can largely regard as likely propaganda to demonize rebel forces in this case. I mean, you have to remember that theoretically the actions that started this was the brutal attack and rape of the leader of this group, who was fully intending to remain allied to Rome and did not, in fact, deserve what was being done to them. I mean, that doesn't excuse them from killing 80,000 people, but it's not as if it was unprovoked. Suetonius would finally regroup, amassing an army of about 10,000 men, and took a stand in a defile with a wood backing them, so that they had really nowhere to go. But they used the terrain to their advantage, launching javelins at the Britons before advancing in a wedge-shaped formation and deploying their cavalry to the sides. Even though the Roman army was heavily outnumbered, Dio says that the rebels were over 200,000 strong at this point, her army was crushed, and according to Tacitus, the Romans spared neither the women nor the animals in this crushing defeat. He states that Boudica poisoned herself and died and was given a lavish burial. Dio says that she fell sick and died and was given a lavish burial. So there's some disagreement as to exactly how she died, but apparently she was given a lavish burial.
Doesn't that same, was she poisoned or was she just sick, thing come up with like Cleopatra as well? Oh, is it?
Cleopatra was not sick. Cleopatra either killed herself or poisoned herself, according to historical records. There's no debate as to whether or not she was sick. There's debate as to whether or not she stuck a knife in her gut or got bit by a snake. But that was entirely her own doing. Or was murdered by a Roman who came upon her, and then they turned it around into her killing herself as a sign of cowardice or something, and propagandized that all over historical records.
You know, across the great history of our Roman Empire, there's been a lot of revolts that end with everybody on the other side dead. Do you think we're the baddies?
Well, look, I'm not saying... I'm not saying... Look, war is nasty and icky, and everyone is at fault. Nobody needed to burn and salt the earth in any of these cases, but they did. Also, remember, some of these accounts are written like 200 years after the fact. I mean, literally, it could have been that she let women and children go, and Roman historians just did not write that because they wanted her to seem more vilified in the process, you know? It could have been that the Romans did not murder every woman and animal on the field of battle, but wanted to seem stronger and more vindictive as a way to show propaganda through history annals.
But we're also talking about the same, it was an empire at this point. That was like, we're just going to kill 1/10 of our own men to embolden them to fight Spartacus.
That was a custom called decimation, which had been created, and it had largely fallen out of favor by the time of Spartacus. That's why it was revived by Crassus. So that was no longer common in the empire. It had been before, but also think about it this way. In the Roman Empire, so one of the things you could do is if you were part of an annexed territory, you could serve as a Roman legionnaire, and when you ended your time serving, you would be given citizenship and land, right? So it was a very... And Romans really did welcome just about anyone to citizenship so long as they kind of completed and followed along with everything that needed to be done. So you have to think, back when decimation was more common, a lot of these legions might have been made up of non-Romans at the time, perhaps, or, farmers and such, like less wealthy Romans, who might have considered desertion better than death. And if desertion rates were really, really high, killing a tenth of your force might have actually been less wasteful than all of the consequences that would have had to been pursued if, like, 2/10, like a fifth of them, decided to desert or something like that, or turn to the other side.
So it was just the minorities and the poor. That makes it all okay.
So one of the earliest mentions of Boudica outside of Roman works was the 6th century work by the British monk Gildas called the De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae. However, that's obviously 500 years past. He describes her as a treacherous lioness who butchered the governors who had been left to give voice and strength to the endeavors of Roman rule. Bede, in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, also recorded her, and so does the Welsh monk Nennius in the Historia Britonum. They both mention this uprising, but neither of those two mention Boudica specifically. There is no contemporary writing about Boudica that exists. However, Dio, about a century later, once described her, saying that in stature she was tall, in appearance terrifying, the glance of her eye most fierce, her voice harsh, a great mass of tawny hair fell to her hips, and around her neck was a large golden necklace. She wore a tunic of divers colors, and a thick mantle fastened over this, and this was her attire. In the Renaissance, right, where the works of Tacitus and Cassius Dio became available in England after they were translated, and largely, because, Romantic era and stuff like that, her status was kind of changed in history and in portrayals. She was often represented by poets and dramatists and historians, and she was called Boudica in the Anglican history by an Italian scholar. She was portrayed in a very romantic light. Like, this was a woman who led her people in an uprising against the unfair oppressors, which is not altogether untrue. And it very much dramatized the fact that when the Romans initially came to her people, and, her daughters, and it would have been her daughter's turn to take over, and, for her to kind of retire, that they whipped her and raped her daughters. So it became a really dramatized and popular thing to represent throughout kind of the 17th to the 19th century in art and poems and such. It's said originally people thought that she may have been buried under where now exists the space between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross Station in London, but there's no evidence for this, and it's likely a post-World War II invention to sort of claim popularity.
Would you say platform
9 3/4? Yeah. Boudica was also adopted by the suffragettes as one of their symbols for the campaign of women's suffrage in Britain, and in 1908 a Boudica banner was carried by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies at their marches. She appeared as a character in a pageant of great women by Cicely Hamilton, which opened at the Scala Theatre in London in 1909 before going on national tour. Was described as the eternal feminine, the guardian of the hearth, the avenger of its wrongs upon the defacer and the despoiler. There is a minority of people, but a very vocal minority, that claim Boudica as a Celtic Welsh heroine in sort of history, even though the area she is from is not technically Welsh, I believe. So statues of her have been erected throughout Wales, and there are permanent exhibitions describing her and her revolt in several museums throughout the places that were affected by the revolt.
Look, for all of not London on the British Isles, there's just this innate, internal desire to see someone sack London. I can see why they would.
I mean, Londinium has been sacked. I saw one of the remaining walls of Londinium when I was there. It's super cool. Anyways, so that's Boudica.
So yes, if you want to move on to the servant, you're welcome to. Boudica Rider.
I knew she was that is not okay.
So Boudica is one of the earliest servants in FGO. She summoned a fair bit younger than she would be in life by the time of her rebellion, because why not? I assumed in my notes here that you would have some contention with her design, and I don't really have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of her first stage, but stage 3's okay. I mean, that's about like Fate is horny. I get it. Stage 3 is acceptable. I am literally starting to get beaten down over the idea of
desensitized.
Yeah. I mean, like,
look, you got to see a man in a thong earlier.
Yeah, and look, there's a cloak with fur and the hair down to her hips.
But yeah, moving on from the design, Boudica is a very kind and caring servant.
Aww.
If you aren't Roman.
Her family.
Yes.
What she wanted to protect.
Even with Romans, though, she's not outright hateful towards them, being openly willing to work with them if it comes down to it, but she will never truly trust or befriend a Roman.
Yeah.
We've also seen an angrier version of her as an Avenger or a Berserker, but it was mostly for a gag, and it has no unique designs or noteworthy traits.
That's disappointing. I think, Faye, what you should do is you should make an Avenger Boudica, age her up about 20 years, right? And just have it, like, I mean, go like ripped up kilt, like blue body paint, wild hair down to here, just like a giant sword. Like, I really think you should go Avenger Boudica, 20 years older, looking like a demon out, like a Celtic demon.
Well, congratulations, you can join the Boudica fans that have been begging Lasagna for an Avenger or Berserker Boudica for quite a while, actually. I'll actually comment here that part of why people really hate Septim, amongst many other reasons, is that Boudica is kind of done blandly there. Mm-hmm. You remember in the campaign I made negotiations with Boudica an actual sticking point in the chapter? Yeah,
and I got advantage on it, luckily, because my character's backstory is like archaeology, specifically of the British Isles. So, like, you gave me a little bit of an advantage, but we did have to convince her to aid us and convince her that we were intending to destroy the Romans.
Yeah, so, but in the original FGO, she's just kind of working with Nero, and why she is willing to do it is explained away in one line and never touched again.
Well, I mean, I will say, the thing is, even though she is contemporary to Nero, right? It's not as if her story indicates a whole lot of conflict directly with Nero. You know what I mean? Like, Nero was largely somewhat hands-off, we learned when we kind of went over his video. He was concerned with other things. And I mean, he certainly likely had, like, the final say in some of the decisions made, but on the whole, her main conflict was with those who attacked her, and that was, like, the ruler of, like, Roman Britain, and he was directed to do that by kind of, like, the council, right? That was like saying, okay, we'll just annex them now that their king is dead, which is somewhat a commentary on the inherent patriarchal nature of Roman culture. I think in most cases, Romans generally believed that if like a king died and they didn't have a son to take over, they could just annex that land because women couldn't be rulers. But I mean, once again, it's a patriarchal society. So it's not as if they're specifically calling out the Iceni people. Like, they would have done this to anyone. So it's not like a personal grudge match, per se.
Fate explains it away as just that Nero didn't know, so it's okay.
Well,
and Boudica
no, Nero
has more
knew.
important things to worry about.
No, Nero knew.
So, but
had to have.
The not lore reason why this happened, though, is she probably did play a much more important role in Septim's story early on, as it's come out that earlier drafts of Septim would have touched more into Nero as a cruel ruler, closer to her Babylon, her Whore of Babylon depictions that we saw in the Nero video. But Nasu kind of kiboshed the idea because he felt it was too early in FGO to start including beasts and the evil Nero stuff. So doing this meant that the writer had to go back and completely rewrite the beast part out, and what we kind of got a Septim was the quickly rewritten, stripped down version that reused a lot of assets and characters previously set aside for the story, leading many of the characters being sidelined even worse than a lot of other FGO chapters, and the entire thing just feeling kind of rushed.
Okay. So I've got something I don't get normally. There's a Boudica quote section here for Fate Grand Order that's pretty new, I think, to the Wikia. I haven't seen this before for a lot of characters.
So, this is new here for sure.
Yeah.
I actually found it in the other wiki too, and we could look at the other wiki if you want to see quotes.
No, I mean for some of the other servants we've done, they don't have this section. It's not on, like, all of the Wikias. That's what I mean. I don't mean it's, like, a new section that doesn't exist on the other Wikia. I just mean it's new here. At least for now. So I can see these. I see. Nice to meet you. I am Boudica, or you can just call me Mrs. Boudica. Heading out. Don't mind it. I'm rather fond of fighting anyway. If you're fine with it being me, I'll do anything. Now, what do you wish? Tell me. What are the things that you like? In my case, it's the sky and the earth and people's bonds, and it'll be best if we have some good food. Are you hungry? Okay, let's make something to eat. Delicious. Anyways, got a lot of relationships.
Early FGO servant.
Yep. So, Nero, nope, I'm not going to fight with you. You know, I don't care if you are a divine father or a god. Quit calling me Rome, okay? Got it? All Roman-based servants. Enemy. King Arthur, I know that person. Yep, she was the king of Britain. You did good. You fought well. It must have been tough uniting the lords. Come here, let me pat your head. Oh yeah, because that would have been later in history, technically, because we would place the historical Arthur around the 6th century AD, right? So, yeah, like older sister.
No one tell her that one of the theories for the historical Arthur was based off a Roman general.
Yeah. Everyone on the round table is like a younger brother to me. That's why I dote on them all. Don't you think they're all cute? Adorable. Gareth, I want to take you home. I want to hug and squeeze you. Come on, squeeze! Affectionate to all servants who are related to the British Isles, treating them as if they were her own children, because they're like her distant children. Now, you come from quite a far away place. Do you want to eat galette? Okay. Oh, Emia, glad I ran into you. Want to go to the basement together? I was thinking of picking out ingredients for dinner tonight. I can't tell if that's menacing or not.
It's not supposed to be menacing.
Okay.
She's like one of the chefs of Chaldea, along with Emia.
Okay. It's Kat. Listen, about that cake we were talking about earlier. I see. The oven. Oh, I get it now. Thanks. I can really count on Kat.
And Tom Mocat.
Yep. Wow, so you're a king. You don't look like one. No, I mean it in a good way. Oh, do you want to eat something? Want me to bake you a galette? Okay, what's the first thing you do when you come back from race shifting? Have you forgotten what Nightingale One-san told you to do? That's right, wash your hands and gargle. Good, you're so wonderful. Why is this just so much better mother than... Who was it?
Raiko?
Yeah. So much better.
Not being a berserker helps.
Yeah, but still. Alright, I'm down to abilities now.
So, Boudica is pretty standard as far as your average warrior servant's going to go. Swing sword, occasional sword laser. We'll get to that later. Mm-hmm. Actually, some of her raw stats is going to leave a lot to be desired. Her noble phantasm's really the only thing she has as far as crazy type moon abilities go. And in these cases, in this kind of case, she's held up mostly by her skills, which act to make her more of a tank than a fighter with like just how she plays and works in lore.
Okay. So I see battle continuation, vow to the goddess, a vow to Andraste, the goddess of victory in ancient Britannia, granting a modifier, protection of Andraste, divine protection bestowed by the goddess of victory. So you got two noble phantasms, the chariot of Boudica and the sword of Boudica.
So the chariot of Boudica is Boudica's primary mount. It actually functions more as a defensive NP, using the blessings of the Celtic gods to allow her to shield herself and her allies. So pulling on that Celt thing you mentioned.
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
It can still be used offensively, though, as the entire thing does fly, and it is very durable. Durable enough to be used as an effective battering ram.
Oh. So you're saying we could have used that for America?
Yes.
Okay.
And then there's the sword of Boudica. Boudica's sword is likened to a weaker Excalibur, capable of firing smaller monoprojectiles at a more rapid pace than Excalibur can. It's useful for incorporation into her fighting style to add extra damage to her attacks, but it's far from any kind of special trump card, being more of an armament than anything else. It's not like... The lasers are not Excalibur laser, they're like throwing a knife at you kind of laser.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take a peek down here at Berserker Avenger Blackened because you haven't pulled them up separately and I'm just curious.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah.
So this is probably from the Septim manga. I don't know anything about the Septim manga. That's the next one we have to read, but it's not in English yet.
Oh, same person as Blood Axe, Jaguar Man, Parvati. Okay. So we've seen. Alright. Let's see.
You don't want to see the NPs?
Forgot about the NPs.
There's one, since she's older, it's a...
Yeah. Yeah. Drop a horse on him. I'm gonna skip ahead. Oh, what fine horses.
I just leveled her recently.
And?
That's it.
She useful? I assume this is what
She's
we're
kind
cutting.
of meh, I'm gonna be honest, gameplay-wise, but I just felt like leveling her.
Is this what we're cutting? Or are we good?
I know, this one's still good.
Okay. Oh, so it's the very last one?
It's our next video now. We'll have one cut.
So on Zenobia.
No, not the next sermon, the next video.
There's no more videos.
No. The next video that we have to record. Got a fucking handshake this time.
Yeah, take down Nero. Beat her up. Beat her up, beat her up. Yeah. I'm appreciating the fact that they're beating up Nero. Baseball. Aww.
She
Their
got
little pitcher's
big
mitt.
arm there.
She also got... She's just chunky in general.
Yeah.
Dimensions are a little off from what you expect. Okay. Let's see. Not a whole lot. No extra art.
Foot.
A fair amount of these, though. Although it looks like a lot. Oh, yeah, I've seen some of these in other. Alright. Victory Rose. Oh, it's a cake. Valentine's chocolate from Boudica. Sorry it's so big, really. But look, that means that I was able to stuff more love into it. How's that? Don't eat it in one go. You can leave some for later, okay? No, I will be eating it all in one go. Thirst for victory. The unpromised sword of victory. Despite having the name Victory, Queen Boudica's life ended in defeat. Even so, she stood against all sorts of tyranny with courage, and her path of reaching victory has left an eternal impression in people's hearts. I mean, much like Spartacus, like, she and Spartacus, like, two peas in a pod in terms of, like, fame in kind of the post-Roman world.
Oh, they got along pretty well,
their...
if I remember right, in Septim.
I know, but I just, like, in sort of their, like, fame, because Zenobia doesn't have nearly the amount of fame in the Western world as Boudica and Spartacus do. I mean, Zenobia is famous, but not on the same level, which is going to be interesting when we get to her. Shiny goddess! That looks delicious. I don't know what it is, but it's blue and I love blue. Beautiful sunlight pours through the green trees. While watching her friends frolic on the beach, she smiles under the shade of the trees. Everyone has their own way of enjoying summer. A mature woman doesn't frolic, not so much. Aw, heroic spirit dress. That's very cute. A nice little dress for her to wear. I'm a fan. Fergus. Jackie. I know who that is. No. CTK. Okay, that's who the redhead in the back was.
CTK. What does that stand for?
Caldea Kitchen Truck?
Yeah.
Yeah. Unlimited Burger Works, remember?
That's right.
We talked about it before. Unlimited Burger Works. That's who the redhead in the back is. For some reason, I thought this was Benny Enma.
Have we seen everyone in there?
Pretty sure. Have we seen...
I think that's Martha. That's where we saw it from, remember?
Okay. Well, there's also Tamamo Cat and Emiya.
Yep.
So, makes sense. Oh, God, no.
Is this one of them find the servants ones?
I
can't see any servants at this angle, so you ain't getting any help from me.
Alright. Okay. In the comments, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but is it possible that this is maybe her right here by the shoulder? Because I just see red hair, and it looks like it could be her. Because she's definitely not over in this group, or in this one, or up there, or down here. So, that would be my guess. Y'all in the comments let us know. You're better at spotting this than either of us, considering he's colorblind and my eyesight is shit. Lakeshore for Heavenly Nymphs. I don't know who that's with her. But it's a Halloween.
I know, it's Halloween.
On that day of azure sky, just having a walk over there, putting on cute makeup with a light touch, let the crystal eyes shine brilliantly, leisurely bursting out silver chime-like laughter. The tea leaves is slightly expensive than usual and extra sweet confections, right? That has not been translated super well. Some of those were not sentences. Crayon Choco and Doodle. Oh yeah, there she is, cooking.
That might be someone else's Valentine's, so it might not be worth reading.
I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. We know the...
Yeah, we know.
There is no translation.
I guess they would be one of the newer Valentines.
It's Valentine's 2023. I can try. Yeah, there's nothing in there gonna spy. Valentine's Day. Oh, it's from Kumonryu Eliza. It's from 8 Dragon, the 9 Dragon Eliza. Crayon chocolate created by Boudica based on the idea of Eliza and was treated with insect repellent techniques by Goldolf, and Edison planned mass production. The taste of chocolate has not changed and the durability is approximately 2,000 years. The drawings are of people that Nine-Tailed Dragon Eliza loves as much as she can think of, but it seems like there's still something left to be desired. He actually wanted to draw 108 people. It's a great day, Shuryo. I wanted to put it in a picture frame and display it, but Eri-chan, the 9-crested dragon, was shy and rejected this.
So that the names get changed, like they switch between R's and L's every time that conundrum comes up.
Yeah. It's cute, though.
Mm-hmm.
So, Zenobia was queen during the 3rd century of the Palmyrene Empire in Syria. So that's why I said she's born about around 240 and dies after 274. Zenobia bore the surname Septimia, and she did have a native Aramaic name, Bat Zabai, which means daughter of Zabai. This was pretty uncommon in Palmyra at the time, but the personal name that follows doesn't necessarily denote her father, but it refers to an ancestor of the family. In Greek, which was the diplomatic second language of Palmyra, she used the name Zenobia. Some historians believe it's likely that she would have used a Greek name in deference to her Greek subjects, because Palmyra did resign over those with some Greek descent in them, and it would have been easier than an Aramaic name. So there is some archaeological evidence of her life. There are statues, bases with inscriptions, although no contemporary statues exist. And there are obviously portraits of her done on coins, right? Which is one of the easiest ways to find depictions of various rulers from different time periods, is on coin faces. Palmyran art statues are pretty impersonal, unlike Greek and Roman. So any statue of Zenobia in the Palmyrian style would have kind of just shown the way that she dressed and her jewelry, but it wouldn't have actually shown her true face. It would have kind of just shown like one of a selection of like kind of free use faces, basically almost like Shutterstock stock images, like this is the white woman according to Shutterstock or something like that. Unfortunately, a lot of ancient sources about her are pretty unreliable. One of the most notable sources of her is the Historia Augusta, which is literally known to be very full of fabrication. The authors of the Historia Augusta invented events and letters ascribed to her because they didn't have any contemporary sources. So only some accounts from the Historia Augusta are able to be collaborated with other sources, which is pretty interesting. As a result, there's a later Byzantine chronicler called Zonaras, who's considered an important source on Zenobia, her life, and her actions. So Palmyra kind of had an amalgamation of people who all spoke Semitic languages, primarily Aramaeans and Arabs, but Zenobia cannot be defined with any one group of this. Nothing is known about her mother, and her father's identity is pretty debated. There are some sources that name a sister of the Queen of Palmyra named Nafsha, but it may refer to Zenobia herself because it's pretty doubtful that she had a sister. So she was not a commoner. She did receive an education appropriate for a noble girl. And according to the Historia Augusta, no matter how dubious that may be, it's said that her childhood hobby was hunting. She was fluent in Egyptian and Greek and also spoke Latin. And she, in 255, when she was around 14, became the second wife of Odeanathus, who was the lord of Palmyra. It's also possible that Zenobia and Odeanathus shared some ancestry, as there was a fairly strong tradition amongst the noble families of intermarriage. Interestingly enough, there is some contemporary epigraphical knowledge about who may have been her father. So there's a man named Julius Aurelius Zenobius who shows up as a strategos of Palmyra from 231 to 232, and some historians have speculated based on the similarity of names that this might possibly be her father. They're also presuming that he would have had a statue that stood opposite to her in the great colonnade of one of the palaces. But a different linguist once pointed out that Zenobia's statue actually stands opposite to a statue ascribed to Odeanathus, not Zenobia, not Zenobius, which would reject the initial hypothesis that this is her father, and her statue stands kind of directly across from it. Also, the name that she claimed, like the secondary name, right, that she claimed, Septimia, so Zenobia Septimia, was not born of someone named Zenobius' child, because his child likely would have bore the name Julia Aurelia because of the way that Roman names flowed down the tree. There's another inscription apparently about her that cites her as a daughter of Antiochus, and this is where people think that she may be connected to Cleopatra, because if it's Antiochus the Seleucid king, either Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes or Antiochus the Seventh Sidetes, Antiochus the Seventh Sidetes' wife was Cleopatra Thea, and we talked about how the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the other dynasty all intermarried with one another in like the 200-300 years post the death of Alexander. They would literally just sent daughters around in a circle so that they were all intermarried and connected. However, it's not. Most historians agree that Zenobia would not have just created a random ancestry with herself to associate herself with Macedonian rulers. So if she has Seleucid ancestry, most historians do believe that would be true, right? Like if she is represented with Seleucid ancestry, it's likely that she did actually possess it, because based on what we know about her, she doesn't seem to be the kind of person who would aggrandize herself in this way. So the reason why people think that she may have been a descendant of Cleopatra is actually from that unspecified source, the Historia Augusta. According to that, we talked before, via Cleopatra Selene being sent away after the death of Cleopatra, Cleopatra Selene, we know, married into a royal house somewhere to kind of the east of Egypt. And that royal house, according to Historia Augusta, is connected to the royal house of Palmyra. And so that's how you would trace her ancestry down in that direction. Although remember that it's like 250-ish years, right, that you're tracing this ancestry. It is a long time, especially for records that might not have been so certain. And records of women are never as, what's a good word? Never as complete as records of male heirs. Even if they were, theoretically one of the possible heirs to Egypt, nobody cared. Palmyra, in kind of the early centuries AD, was subordinate to Rome and part of the Syria Phoenice province. In 260, Valerian, the Roman emperor, had marched against Sassanid Persia and their monarch Shapur I, on the account of the fact that Shapur I had invaded eastern sections of the emperor. Valerian was defeated and captured near Edessa because apparently he was not that great at military maneuvers. And Odenathus, who was formally loyal to Rome, and its emperor, who after the capture of Valerian was Galenius, was then declared the king of Palmyra for his loyal service. He launched a successful campaign against Persia because of these actions taken against Valerian, and eventually, after his victory, would be crowned King of Kings of the East in 263. He crowned his eldest son, Herodianus, as co-ruler, and he received a lot of Roman titles because of winning these conquests. And he essentially was given control of all Roman territories from Palestine to the Black Sea. However, in 267, just a few years later, when Zenobia was only in her late 20s or early 30s, and remember, she's his second wife, he and his eldest son, the co-rulers, were both assassinated when on return from a campaign. So, about two or three years after the death of Odenathus, we get the first dated inscription mentioning Zenobia as queen, and she's titled as Queen of Palmyra. However, she would have technically become queen whenever her husband was king, so it's likely that she was queen before this point, but just hadn't been mentioned as such in historical records. As queen consort, she would have remained in the background, and that's why she wouldn't have been mentioned. But apparently, according to some historians, she was said to have accompanied her husbands on campaigns as well, boosting the morale of soldiers and gaining political influence, all of which would be very useful to her going forward in her position as Queen of Palmyra. So, the Historia Augusta, we keep returning to this because it's absolutely wild. According to the Historia Augusta, Odenathus was assassinated by a cousin named Maeonius, right? And his son from his first wife, named Herodes, was crowned ruler. So we already have a conflict in the name. So you can already tell it's not 100% accurate. But it claims that Zenobia conspired with Maeonius because she didn't like her stepson as her father's heir in front of her own children, and conspired to have her husband murdered.
Sounds like propaganda to me.
Well, also, we talked about the Historia Augusta is not a legitimate source for most things, unless whatever you find written in there can be corroborated by another source. Because the authors of that just made up stuff randomly. So, even though she didn't technically have the power to rule as a queen in her own right, she would have reigned as a queen regent at this time. So she did have a son with Odenathus. And so because she had a son with Odenathus and his first son had been killed, her son would have been second in line. So actually would have been a relatively smooth transition of power, especially if she had popularity amongst the people. Right? She had her son was 10 years old and was named Vabalathus. And so it would have been very easy to just say, this is your next ruler. He's not quite old enough. I will reign as regent. And the thing is, Rome accepted queen regents far more than it ever accepted queen regnants, right? A queen regnant wasn't really a thing, but a queen regent, that happened all the time, you know? Like, father passes away, their son needs to take over, but he's too young. Queen regent or a council to protect them.
In Rome to their emperors.
Yes, it did. So queen regents are fairly common. So she would not have faced, like, for example, we talked about Boudica earlier having issues with her daughters being queen regnants, right? She would not have faced the same political issues that a queen regent or queen regnant would, right? So, like, her form of rule would have been legitimized by Rome. They say, oh, you're just protecting the interests of your son, who is the next rightful ruler. Go off, queen. But regents have a lot of power while their children are growing. For example, Hatshepsut claimed to be regent for her son, and held that regency for like 30 years or something, and just sent him off to war constantly. Historians believe in the hopes that he would be killed at war and she would just become queen. Like, this is a common thing. She held the reins of power very tightly in this kingdom, and Vabalalthus was kept in his shadow, never allowed to exercise real power while he was growing up. Though the monarchy in Palmyra was relatively new, and all of their power was based on the loyalty allegiances made by Odeodatus, so they did have a relatively smooth transfer of power where there might not have normally be, right? So typically in a very newly established monarchy, you might actually have some major issues. But because he had such kind of a good line of succession, like first his first son and then his second son, Zenobia was relatively popular. So it didn't become super, it was not a super complex process for Zenobia to assume power in the name of her son. Odeodatus also controlled a massive amount of area in the Roman East. I mean, we talked about how he basically controlled all Roman territories to the east of a certain point. And so in the region, he had more political and military power than the provincial governors of the area. He actually, in his status, was formalized by the emperor at the time, who really couldn't say no to him at this point. He controlled so much land and military that the Roman Empire could not say, no, you can't rule this area, because he was too powerful. I mean, he might actually succeed in marching on Rome if he did. That's how you do it right, guys. You ally with Rome, get enough power that they cannot bully you while under their allyship, then declare yourself king and say, we are allies so long as you do not fuck with me. However, Odeodatus' Roman titles were not hereditary because they were given as gifts by the emperor at the time. So I went to say her son's name again, and it's so many letters. So I'm gonna call him Val. So Val technically had the legitimate claim to all of the royal titles held by his father, but no right to the Roman titles at the time. However, Zenobia used them for her son, with his earliest known inscriptions being called the King of Kings. And although Rome technically accepted this royal succession, the assumption of the military rank antagonized the emperor. Gallienus might have decided to attempt to regain central authority by dispatching the prefect Aurelius Heraclianus, but Heraclianus was easily repelled by the Palmyran army when he was sent there. Let's see. So during her territorial control over Palmyra, her authority was pretty powerful, right? So until 270, she was confined to Palmyra itself, but in 270, this changed because Zenobia undertook the conquest of the Levant and Egypt at the time. She essentially undertook a massive expansion of the Palmyran borders, where she would give up on just safeguarding and placating her neighbors by fortifying settlements on the Euphrates and such, and seek to actually expand actively south and west from their current base of power. In 269, Claudius Gothicus had been defending the borders of Italy and the Balkans, while Zenobia was cementing her authority, and unfortunately Roman officials in the east were really torn between loyalty to the empire and Zenobia's demands for their allegiance to her and her son. Roman officials refused to recognize Palmyran authority, and all of Zenobia's expansions she undertook were intended to reinforce and protect Palmyran dominance in the region. So in spring of 270, when Claudius was fighting the Goths in the mountains of Thrace, Zenobia sent her general Septimus to Basra, which was the capital of a different province called Arabia Petraea. And this was likely intentional because the person who would have controlled the legions in her general area of the world was fighting a different threat, right? So she saw an opening. In Arabia, the Roman government tried to confront the Palmyrans and was routed and killed. Zabdas sacked the city and destroyed the temple of Zeus Hammon, which was the legion's revered shrine inside the area. A Latin inscription attests to its destruction. And then several other cities were destroyed by the Palmyrans in the area in the effort to subjugate the Tanukids, who were the traditional people living in that area at the time. This force would continue marching south into the Jordan Valley. There's evidence that Petra was sacked by a small contingent at the time as they moved south, subjugating Arabia and Judea. Palmyran dominance of Arabia is confirmed by Palmyran milestones along their route bearing Val's name. Right? So Zenobia was smart. She knew that she had to put this in her son's name if she wanted it to really succeed. Yeah, she could not name this in her own name and be kind of left to it. She had to undertake this in the name of her son. Interestingly enough, the invasion of Arabia coincided with the cessation of coin production in Claudius's name by the mint in Antiochia, indicating that she had already begun to tighten her grip in Syria, and then so by 270 the mint was then issuing coins in her son's name. She then headed down to invade Egypt, which was likely due to her desire to perhaps get a separate trade route to the Euphrates, which had been kind of cut by the war with Persia that had been earlier. However, unfortunately, historians kind of doubt this because the Euphrates route was not entirely cut during the war, and so she still technically would have been able to trade through there, which means that by telling it the way that she just wanted a trade route, it minimizes her ambition to power, right, in the history. Historians can't really agree on when she invaded Egypt exactly, but generally it is sometime in or after 270, within a year, right? So 270 to 271. And she just invaded Egypt and declared herself queen. Rather successfully. Unfortunately, Roman position in the region was super bad because the prefect of Egypt at the time was off battling pirates who were harassing the Egyptian trade fleets and shores. And unfortunately, the Palmyrans were also being helped by an Egyptian general named Timagenes, who helped them move over 70,000 soldiers into Egypt immediately, defeating the Romans, who were only 50,000 strong. And eventually, the Palmyrans would kind of believe themselves safe enough to withdraw the main force and leave a large garrison. By November, another Roman returned, assembled an army, and had expelled the Palmyrans and regained Alexandria, which prompted them to return, aiming for Alexandria, and they succeeded. They then chased the Romans south down the Nile.
Amount of days since we've been re-annexed.
Not very many. Luckily, this Egyptian general who was aiding them, Timagenes, had a really good knowledge of the Egyptian land, helping them ambush the Roman rear. So the man leading the Roman armies then committed suicide, and Egypt officially became part of Palmyra. Which is fucking hilarious. So the Palmyrans also annexed Galatia, and according to some historians, also reached into Ancyra, with mints kind of producing coins distributed all through these regions. However, she did attempt to turn her campaign towards Chaldea, right? Babylon.
Yeah.
It's Babylon. She attempted to turn her campaign towards Babylon, but it's pretty poorly documented if she actually succeeded, and it doesn't appear that any part of like the western area of like Chaldea actually came under the control of Zenobia and Val, because there were no coins minted for them, no Palmyran inscriptions have been found. So if she did turn that way, she did not succeed. Like, it didn't work out for her, which is unfortunate, but you know, you win some, you lose some. You got Egypt. That's the big one. Zenobia's rule was interesting. So she rules over an area that is populated by a whole lot of different cultural zones. She had Semitic, Hellenic, and sort of Egyptian zones all over in her emperor, and so she represented herself as a Syrian monarch, a Hellenistic queen, and a Roman empress, depending on who she was representing herself to, which gained broad support for her cause kind of all across the area that she was ruling over. Remember, kids, presenting yourself as respecting the cultures of the people you are subjugating is likely to win their favor. That, and Egypt has a long history of the fact that everyone who annexed Egypt just essentially became Egyptian eventually, and then it didn't really matter that they'd annexed Egypt and they were a different people because they were basically Egyptian. This is why we have Egyptian dynasties ruled by people who weren't Egyptian, but they depicted themselves as Egyptian and sometimes had Egyptian names and essentially didn't try to disrupt Egyptian culture because it was never going to happen.
Egypt really is France of the ancient world.
I mean, yeah, you have to give credit to Egypt. I mean, Egyptian culture stood relatively identifiable and distinct for over like 3,000 years, even past 3,000 years, well into the Roman period. It was still distinctively Egyptian. I mean, a whole lot of people came in and conquered Egypt at various intervals, like during the intermediate periods. Do you ever see a shift from Egyptian culture to something different?
No. In fact, it has to be a fun fact brought up every time that Cleopatra was probably lighter of skin.
Yeah. And guess what? Cleopatra knew to portray herself as an Egyptian pharaoh.
Yeah. It's like, man, you want to talk about like melting pots of the ancient world? You got
there was
Egypt
no
there.
no, because melting pot implies that all cultures come together and create something new. Egypt was not a melting pot. Egypt was a brick wall.
Sorry, no, it's a vat of acid that dissolves it and dropped into it.
Yes. Like, you come to Egypt, you become Egyptian. There is no Romanizing Egypt. No, literally, Romans would bury themselves after being mummified the Egyptian way at a certain point. They were so Egyptianized. Good on you, Egypt.
Like, people say one in Rome, do as the Romans do, but one in Egypt, you are Egyptian.
One of the more interesting things I found about Zenobia's reign is that even though under her control all of these missions were overtaken to conquer different parts, she actually turned her Palmyran court into a huge center of intellectual and sophist learning. She gathered academics to the city, and it essentially replaced all the classical learning centers like Athens for sort of anything east of there, like the Syrians and such. She invited the philosopher Longinus to court, and she also allowed intellectuals, honestly, starting in her reign and afterwards, Syrian intellectuals would begin to argue that Greek culture was not evolving in Greece, but adapting from contact with Greeks in the Near East, because the great Greek philosophers were just reusing Near Eastern and Egyptian ideas. Her court would have been dominated by this school of thought, representing the Palmyran dynasty as a Roman imperial one, succeeding Persian, Seleucid, and Ptolemaic rulers who controlled this Hellenistic region and made it better and evolved it. She embarked on a bunch of restoration projects throughout Egypt even. One of the colossi of Memnon was restored in antiquity to once again sing like it was supposed to. And such during her time. She also she followed Palmyran paganism famously, which was a sort of a Semitic pantheon with Bel at the head, but she allowed for the accommodation of Christian and Jewish worship, and did not actively seek to subjugate those who did not believe in the same form of kind of mythology that she did. In 272, there is a Manichaean manuscript that says that she supported them in establishing a community in Abdar under the rule of a different king, and in getting them settled without warfare and such. So much like the Romans kind of purported to do, she ruled over this vastly multicultural empire, and she did not try to change her people to become sort of one singular populace who all believed in the same thing. The Romans knew not to do this too. It was never going to work. There are just too many different cultural groups and regions for you to ever sort of disseminate one true religion or culture across all of it. But she was a fairly accommodating queen, even more so than Rome in some ways, because she also really appreciated sort of the philosophy and learning. Even in Rome, Greek sort of Greek thought and Greek learning centers, like in Athens, were considered more culturally sophisticated than Roman ones in Rome.
This is a great cultural practice that future generations of nations will endeavor to ignore.
Yeah, yeah. There were even bishops in Alexandria who wrote that Zenobia did not give churches to the Jews to make them into synagogues, but she understood the power of these bishops in Christian communities and believed in each sort of people being able to keep their own centers of worship. She even gave a man named Paul the rank of a minor judge, and helped him keep his diocesan church after being removed as Bishop of Antioch. However, this led to representations of her in history not being super great after her death, because less than 100 years later, there was a man named Athanasius of Alexandria who wrote a history of the Arians and called her a Jewess, and insinuated that she was Jewish and that she was a proselyte, and that was why rabbis didn't like her and such. And Talmudic sources are pretty hostile to Palmyra. So, in the post period, there's this there's this kind of like theological war between seeing Zenobia as a Jew and seeing her as sort of coming from a line of people who traditionally oppressed the Jews, because her husband, Odeanathus, at one point had undertaken a wiping out of Jews in one region of the area that he was ruling. So Jewish sources and Arab sources have some conflict on whether to view her as one of their own or kind of the outsider who was part of a oppressive line. It's likely that she spent most of her time reigning in the administrative center of the empire. She was not out there on the front lines participating in these battles. That was not her place. She was not like Boudica. She very much reigned from the administrative center of her little empire. She was very much a political force who controlled a military force rather than a military force herself, which I personally think is a very good idea for her. She pretty much avoided provoking Rome initially until she had established her power, and essentially, after expanding her territory, was recognized as an imperial partner for the eastern half of the emperor, presenting her son as subordinate to the emperor, but ruling all of this very wealthy territory. Eventually, she would mint coinage that bore the portraits of Aurelian and Val, emperor and king, with the regnal year.
This sounds like that. Remember in Game of Thrones, there's that group, like that trio of families that are like, oh, you guys are subordinate to the king, but also the king's gonna lose any war if they're not on his side. Yeah. You remember that set of families, right?
Yep. Unfortunately, around 271, she declared herself, supposedly, we know via coin minting and inscriptions, she ascribed herself titles that were associated with the kind of position of Roman empress and assumed imperial titles. And that was a signal to Rome that she was declaring independence and open rebellion against the emperor at the time, Aurelian. The timeline's a little vague, but essentially Aurelian would then march east, being delayed in the Balkans, and she would claim the title, this imperial title, and understood the inevitability of conflict, and this usurpation, which began in 272, had ended by August. Aurelian would spend the winter in Byzantium and cross the Bosporus in April. Galatia fell, the Palmyran garrisons had withdrawn, and Syro was regained, which we had talked about being annexed earlier. Aurelian essentially moved straight into Syria, the heartland of Palmyra, and by early June, Alexandria had been recaptured by the Romans, followed by the rest of Egypt by the third week of June. Zenobia had drawn all of her armies back inwards to focus on Syria, in the hopes that she would be able to hold Syria, because if Syria lost, that would be the end of the Palmyran emperor. In May, Aurelian had already headed toward Antioch. He defeated the Palmyran army at the Battle of Emae, and as a result, Zenobia, who was waiting in Antioch, retreated with her army to Emesea. To conceal the disaster and make her escape safer, she spread propaganda that Aurelian was captured, and Zebatus found a man who resembled him, parading him through Antioch in a sort of a faux victory to not freak anyone out, so that everyone believed that they were safe. The following day, Aurelian entered the city, marched south, defeated the garrison south of Antioch, and met her in battle at Emesa. The Palmyran army was about 70,000 strong and nearly managed to rout the Romans in this battle. During the initial part of the battle, they felt the victory was close and broke their lines to advance, which enabled the infantry to attack them at their flanks. Zenobia headed back to her capital on the device of her war council, leaving her treasury behind, and prepared for a siege in Palmyra. Aurelian blockaded all food supply routes into the city and tried to negotiate with her at this point. Zenobia, according to the Augustan history, said that she would help Aurelian fight, but likely this was a piece of propaganda used to link her to the Persians, which were the traditional enemies of Rome. Aurelian sent a contingent to capture the queen before she could cross the Euphrates into Persia while she was fleeing. And in Palmyra, soon after the news of her captivity reached the city, she sent the queen and her son to Emesa for trial, along with most of the court. Zenobia blamed her actions all on her advisors, according to some histories, although most of those histories were written by later Romans who were hostile towards her. It's reported that she showed great cowardice, but once again, Roman historians writing after. Aurelian had almost all of his prisoners from this conflict executed, but spared the queen and her son to be paraded through the streets in his victory triumph, much like Cleopatra's children were paraded through the streets during Octavian's. Well, because Octavian had wanted to parade Cleopatra and all of her children, but he ended up just parading her 3 younger children by Mark Antony through the streets. It's said that he had her chained and seated on a chair for 3 days before the city's population after being paraded through the streets, and then when she appeared in his triumph, she was beheaded. There is one source that says she dies before reaching Rome, but most agree that there was some sort of public humiliation event. However, one historian, Malalas, says that her life was spared and he gave Zenobia a villa in Tibur near Hadrian's, where she would then live with her children, marry a nobleman or a Roman senator, and that house has now become a tourist attraction in Rome. So, there are very varying stories about her death or not death in this case, which is pretty interesting to me because in general, if you look at Roman history, usually when a foreign ruler kind of acts out against them, Rome is quite quick to quell the rebellion, kill the offending factors, and then make sure that's known in history. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we've got 3 or 4 different accounts of whether or not she even died, when and where, and if she lived beyond this, is fairly interesting.
It's somewhat weird. I can see, if we had known for a fact they had spayed her, I can kind of see why, if she did rule over such a larger area of land with a lot of influence, it could have been more of a political move to maintain control in the region.
But Cleopatra's children were technically the rightful inheritors of all of Egypt. Could have married them to someone living. There's a lot of examples of Rome taking enemies who rolled over large regions, and they did not give a shit.
Different emperors, different executions, maybe. But yeah, it does still seem far-fetched. True,
and I will say, of all the people that she could have conflicted with, Aurelian was definitely an interesting one. And he was even given the title Restorer of the World because during his time in power, he was very famous for ending crisis after crisis.
Keeping in mind, he spent most of this time looking the other way from Zenobia's actions, only and really stepped in at the very end.
No, because remember, when she started ruling, the emperor was Gallienus.
That's right.
She lived through the rule of at least 3 different Roman emperors, starting from Valerius, then Gallienus his son, and then Aurelian.
But with the last role, he even offered her negotiation when it looked like things were going to go his way anyways. So
yeah. But Aurelian was really, really influential as an emperor. I mean, he basically solved all the crises of the 3rd century during his reign, and just well regarded in general by Roman historians. So, I mean, I could see maybe that could be a reason for him to spare her, but it doesn't.
It still feels far-fetched when other theories claim she was executed. It seems like a far more prevalent telling of that. And that lines up more with Roman history in general.
Exactly. I'm not going to get into her descendancy, because we know about one child by her, but historians have claimed that there are others, and that later Seleucid kings would claim her as their mother, and so on and so forth. But with as little as we know about her that's actually substantiated by like genuine, like multiple corroborated fact, I would not want to get into debating whether or not she had more than one child. That just, to me, does not seem productive at this point. She, like the other 2 servants of our video, there have been more romantic later portrayals of her, especially when you think about when all of these Latin texts were finally being translated through like the late Middle Ages and into kind of like that 16th, 17th, 18th century. A lot of these people who opposed Rome, like very famously, sort of became romanticized. So much like Spartacus and Boudica, she also became romanticized. She just wasn't quite as popular and well known as the 2 of them, and that's likely because she is coming from a kingdom far to the east, so she's much more popular in Eastern history than she is in Western history. If you really make the division along kind of like Persia, sort of Turkey, Egypt.
All right. So, I guess first off, because this one you have no exposure to, I'm like, because the other 2 you've used them in campaign before. You want to take a crack at what class you think she'll be?
Ruler or caster?
Okay. She is an archer class servant.
Oh, okay. That's very Scheherazade. All right. All right. Wow, so, that really does not get better.
We go 3 for 3 with Roman opposers and thongs.
Yeah, is this like a reference to the fact that the Romans always described those opposing them as like fighting naked and shit?
I assume not. It's just hilarious that we did 3 servants today and all 3 of them were wearing thongs, including the giant berserker male.
Yeah.
But right off the bat, Zenobia's design is they do try to justify it in lore as being something she's less than pleased with. This is the garb she was supposedly kept in while she was being humiliated at the Emperor's throne.
Okay. Well, that would make more sense.
Fate says that this is because it is what really defines this version of her as a servant. Mm-hmm. Basically, after being dragged to the Emperor's throne, Fate goes with the coward take here, is that she begged for her life in terror, which is what allowed her to be kept alive in the capital under a husband in house arrest, basically.
Okay, so Fate goes with her living.
She feels incredible shame that she ever begged for her life, and her garb is because she believes that she must surpass that humiliation, not erase it. So she wears it as a means of sort of, look, I should have just fucked the Roman emperor and died there.
Yeah.
She considers the peak of her life to be the exact moment where she overcame the fear that let her end up like this in the first place. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, she can be summoned at an earlier point in her life as more of a warrior queen, probably more properly dressed. Which
would be interesting, because she was never really a warrior queen. Like, unlike Boudica, I mean, she was very much an administrative and political queen, more so than a queen on the battlefield, right? And that is a big distinction when talking about queens in history. There are the queens who are kind of queens on and off the battlefield, right? Like the ones who have a ton of military power that they themselves control, and then there are the ones with political power who have a military that can be controlled because of their political power, right? That's why I would have guessed, I mean, because I'm just going with the more kind of political leaning of her, is I would have said caster or, yeah.
Now, the justification for her design is appreciated, but Type Moon's not coy. We all know that she wears this because...
Yeah, we know.
So
I've got relationships.
Actually, I have a little bit
you're
more
not
to go
there.
here.
Okay.
So I won't spoil what it does, but I'll say in her noble phantasm, she throws off her chains and returns to her more royally befitting appearance. So you will get to see that later.
Oh, okay, good.
Beyond her humiliation, though, she is extremely strong-minded and self-respecting. She has met an FGO in the context of saving her homeland, and she immediately is ready to take anyone out that she needs to. She is, to put it lightly, a very goal-oriented servant.
Makes sense. So, Spartacus, that is the gladiator Spartacus, the greatest talent I could ask for. I wonder if he would join my army. A member of the Shadow Public Morals Committee, indeed, it is extremely important to correct any disturbance in public morals when it comes up in any country or an army. If there's anything I can help with, I will gladly do what... Wait, she's heading this way with a very menacing look on her face. Why? Cleopatra the Seventh is what I long to be. I am not sure how accurate it is, but I have heard I have her blood flowing in my veins. What? She's here? Wait a second, I am not mentally prepared yet. The moment when you meet the thing you fangirl after. I feel it. So, abilities.
So, I don't know entirely why Zenobia is an archer. She primarily fights with a sword and will use her own chains as weapons against the enemy.
So continuing, the Fates archers are anything but archers.
Yeah, basically.
When will we get an actual archer who's an archer?
Arash?
Robin Hood?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little more of an archer, I guess. She does seem to have a fireball launching thing or something of the sort in her animations, but they're hardly her primary combat tools, so yeah. Skill-wise, her skills don't entirely, or don't necessarily explain what they do in lore, and are largely based on aspects of her life, which you probably see here.
Yeah, so I see Pretentious Augusta, right?
So based off gameplay effects, Pretentious Augusta increases the power gain when she declares herself to be
Augusta, mother of the emperor.
Being one observing the Roman emperor. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the title mother. It's like calling yourself like Sekhie Regina, right? Mother of the king.
Which, based on what we know about other Roman servants, like specifically Nero, it probably grants her some sort of like special power increase from that. Yeah.
Like she named her son Augustus, right? Which was the name of the Roman emperor, and herself the female version of that, the mother of the emperor, Augusta. Then I see Siege of Aurelian, which we talked about, the punitive force subjugating Palmyra.
Based off the gameplay effect, this is probably a battle continuation or some kind of skill obtained through the fierceness of her resistance.
That's fair. She did resist pretty strongly. And then Prospering Palmyra.
This one is likely a rallying skill like charisma or tactics for her raw governing brilliance.
Yeah, likely related more to the fact that she was just a really good queen when it came to kind of developing sort of economy and cultural strength, and Palmyra as a route through the desert. I mean, you think her empire spanned most of the major trade lines that ran to Rome from the Silk Road and down into kind of the ends of the Silk Road from Rome. Like, she governed pretty much all of them at the extent of her empire. I see her noble phantasm, Authentic Triumph.
So I don't usually highlight it because it's usually not that important. But our Noble Phantasm is one denoting character development, so I do want you to click into that real quickly if you can.
Okay.
Just ignore the animation there, and I feel like you might get something out of reading out the Noble Phantasm line there.
Commencing verification, those who bore witness to this queen's howl on the battlefield, the dreams you all shared shall shatter my shackles. As I am freed from these bonds, I shall disavow my very self. Authentic Triumph, welcome your true lord's triumphant return. So version 2. Commencing denial, I shall demonstrate my valor to the heavens and the earth. Its brilliance then shall dissolve the shackles that confine me, and thus I will prove my being through an ideal that cannot exist. Authentic triumph, rejoice, your queen returns in triumph. I can only imagine that this is a reference to the idea of a Roman triumph, right? Like literally parading your victory through the streets for all your people to see.
Yeah, so this Noble Phantasm is only usable when she has truly convinced herself that she is an ideal queen growing past her shame of her humiliation. When she uses this, her chains break, she obtains armor, and her spirit origin becomes much stronger as she shines the brilliance. I believe when she uses this, the implication is that she alone is strong enough to repel an entire army. It's a somewhat unique Noble Phantasm, so I'm unsure about whether or not the change is a permanent change or because it's
temporary.
But it's not like her character development just goes backwards after using the Noble Phantasm, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I kind of want to show you that. We can look at the NP animation whenever you're ready. I know you sometimes like look at some of this other stuff.
Well, the only thing I would look at is click into the artist who has done no one else. That is it. Warrior Queen from the Kingdom of the Burning Sands. Archer Zenobia. Oh, look, siege weaponry. Interesting. Excited to see a...
Probably get a better look at.
First of all, yes, we love it. Great baseball. Second of all,
I assume you want to get a good look at that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I see what you mean. It assumes armor. Yeah. Interesting. I like it. I like the armor. Oh. Her artist has done some stuff. Or other artists. Oh, I always like these where you kind of see all the different angles and stuff. Oh. That's some cool ass art. Aww. So cute. Little trebuchet here. Okay. The baseball, alright. So we have 4.
She's a lot newer than Boudica and Spartacus are, so.
So first of all, golden shackles. This is who I am, the garish gleam of vulgar gold. Shackles, the antithesis of freedom. The heavy chain's irritating rattle invites scorn and mockery. It could not be clearer to all that the one who wears them is defeated. These marks of humiliation prove all who behold them that their bearer is guilty of a grievous mistake, and so has been reduced to such a pitiful state. But now we are the beholders. We see these shackles unlocked from without. The gleam becomes ordinary. They no longer offer any impediment to one's freedom. They lie abandoned in the desert sands. And so I say again, this is who I am. Epic. Date chocolate. This dish was made from the dried fruits of a tall tree called Phoenix dactylifera, which belongs to the palme family. In other words, dried dates, approximately 266 kilocalories per 100 grams, coated in slightly bitter chocolate, approximately 50% cacao mass content. Just like her serious yet daring personalities, their taste is perfectly balanced, an exquisite harmony of sweetness and bitterness, and yet their humble and simple flavor naturally encourages you to eat more. Of course, they were handmade, and during the process of making them, you could see the figure of a good wife and wise mother, who does not lose to any other servant in terms of procuring the ingredients, reserving the kitchen, concentrating her focus beforehand, performing efficiency, not adding any evil arrangements, and tidying up completely. However, the biggest problem she faced was being attacked by the president of the Public Moral Committee, who mistook her appearance while cooking as wearing a naked apron. Oh. Heroic Spirit Dream Portrait. Oh, I like that. Yeah. Interesting. Just gonna... it's in Yuga Kshetra.
The Indian lost belt.
No, I mean the actual setting, as in the locate. Oh, Yuga Kshetra. Is that the setting
the Indian
for the Lost Belt? Oh, I didn't realize that was the setting name. Okay. Dream Portrait. I like it. All right. Cruising date. A trip to the sea is so exciting. The gentle drifting scenery on the deck and the scent of the sweet fruit tickles your noses. You can take it easy until we reach our destination. Nice. Definitely my favorite art of her.
You like her after she, with the use of her Noble Phantasm.
Casts free of her shackles. and becomes truly the Queen of Palmyra. I mean, I think I'm gonna be honest. Fate's kind of played it fairly straight with all three of these characters. I mean, they're all, you know, rebels against Roman conquest and oppression in some case, which really ties the three of them together thematically. I mean, like, this video is really tied tightly together on like several levels, which is pretty cool. And I mean, two of the servants technically had connections to Cleopatra by like, you know, second, third degree. Because, I mean, she's related to Cleopatra Selene, and Cleopatra Selene is Cleopatra's daughter, and then, fucking Boudica, and Nero Claudius. Nero Claudius is of the family started by Octavian. Octavian is related to Julius Caesar. And then Spartacus is both contemporary to Julius Caesar, tangled with both of his fellow First Triumvirate members, and also had an encounter with Sicilian pirates, like Julius Caesar. Technically, all three of our servants are connected to Julius Caesar. And by the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon rule, Cleopatra! This episode is just the degrees of Cleopatra.
So I take it you at least like the whole of Fate's, like you like Fate's take on these three.
Yeah, I think Fate did pretty good. I mean, not to say that Fate ever does like bad per se, but like they played it pretty straight, you know?
Now hang on. If we're talking what Fate did bad, you do have to remember back to the thing that connects all three of them.
I'm forgetting about that. Purposefully. Intentionally. With that being said, who is our next servant? We have a hint for them.
Well, I think it's time we take back to the high seas.
Yes.
All this talk of pirates.
We'll see you next time, everybody. Like, comment, subscribe.